You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution podcast, but is just a short bonus episode to remind you about important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the beginning of the Second Continental Congress. Back in the fall of 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to coordinate a unified response to the Coercive Acts. These closed Boston Harbor and took away many of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's rights of self-government as guaranteed by their colonial charter. The colonial leaders met in a Continental Congress in order to present a united front to London against an injustice which they believed threatened all of their rights. The First Congress agreed to some trade restrictions with London and sent petitions to the King and Parliament. They then disbanded and agreed to meet again in May 1775, once London had a chance to respond to their petitions and trade restrictions. If London did not meet their demands, the Second Continental Congress would consider even more drastic trade restrictions and perhaps other measures. Many delegates to the Second Continental Congress were the same men who attended the first one. Not returning were several delegates with a more loyalist bent, believing the body had become more radical and might engage in some treasonous activity. One of the new delegates was Benjamin Franklin. On May 5, 1775, Franklin arrived in Philadelphia after spending many years in London as a colonial agent. Franklin had lost his influence in London after he admitted receiving some intercepted private letters from the royal governor of Massachusetts and forwarding them to Patriot leaders in Boston. Franklin remained in London for a time after that, but decided to return to America when it became clear that war would likely begin in the spring of 1775. Immediately upon his return, Pennsylvania leaders added Franklin to their delegation to the Second Continental Congress, which was scheduled to meet on May 10th. While the plan had been for the Second Continental Congress to consider additional petitions and trade restrictions if London had not reacted favorably to the petitions of the First Congress, events had overtaken them. Officials in London had even refused to consider the petitions, considering the Congress to be an extra-legal body with no authority. More importantly, war had broken out in New England. Tens of thousands of militia had surrounded the British Army in Boston, following the battles of Lexington and Concord. Congress met on May 10th. They elected Peyton Randolph of Virginia as president of the Congress. The first few weeks of the Congress were a scene of chaos and confusion for the delegates as they received the depositions from Lexington and Concord. The siege of Boston, involving tens of thousands of armed militia, was only one issue. Congress soon began to receive reports of other actions all over the continent. Patriot groups were forcing royal governors and regulars to abandon their posts and evacuate their colonies. One of Congress's first decisions was whether their goals had changed. Were they seeking independence at this point? Were they supporting an armed rebellion? Or were they simply just trying to get the king and parliament to move back to the status quo? Congress essentially broke down into three factions. The most conservative faction, led by men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still wanted a return to the relationship that the colonies had with the Parliament at the end of the French and Indian War. Parliament held authority over the empire, but essentially respected the rights of the colonies to govern and tax themselves. Even these most conservative delegates would be considered radicals by Parliament standards, though. Most delegates probably fell into the middle, moderate category. They believed that Parliament could not be trusted to govern the colonies. They still hoped to fashion a compromise with London that would allow the colonial legislatures to govern and tax themselves, but still operate as loyal subjects to the king. They wanted a new power-sharing arrangement that would keep them within the protection of the empire. Most of the southern delegates fell into this category, as well as some from other regions. Finally, the most radical faction accepted the idea that, with war having come, there really was no option other than full independence. John Adams and a few other New England delegates had reached this conclusion, but they dared not express it openly in Congress yet. They realized they needed the moderates to bring the other colonies into the fight. They could not afford to scare them away. As events progressed, they hoped they would accept that nothing would work but independence. Dickinson gave a lengthy speech urging Congress not to go too far too fast. His views really had not changed much since he wrote the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania years earlier to stir up opposition to the Townshend Act. Dickinson thought they had three options. One was stop talking to London and simply fight the war. Dickinson raised fears of British-incited slave revolts in the South, using the Indians against New England, and devastation by regular Army and Navy as making this option far too dangerous. Dickinson and the other conservatives proposed to continue military opposition while petitioning King and Parliament once again. Although previous petitions had fallen on deaf ears, now that Lexington and Concord had shown the colonists would fight, perhaps London would be more amenable to these petitions. A third option would be to send negotiators to London to work out a solution in person, and to Dickinson this seemed like the best option. Dickinson's position, requesting that Parliament simply restore the status quo, put him squarely within the mainstream patriot thought from, say, 5 years earlier. Others, though, had moved on. Most delegates realized they could never trust Parliament to support their best interests. They wanted complete autonomy over domestic affairs with only shared loyalty to the king. A few didn't even want that, but as I said, they were keeping quiet, at least for now. Several delegates spoke in opposition to Dickinson, including Patrick Henry. Even that outspoken Virginia radical did not propose independence. John and Samuel Adams both opposed Dickinson's ideas in letters written afterwards, but they did not want to appear too radical to the rest of Congress in the debates quite yet. The Massachusetts delegation feared the rest of the colonies saying, "You guys are nuts," and leaving them to fight the war on their own. Even if Congress was willing to consider additional diplomatic measures, the delegates also agreed that they had to deal with the war that was raging right now. New England delegations were focused on trying to convince the rest of the colonies to join them in a united action. They still needed to overcome the concerns of some delegates that open warfare against the king's army would be treated as outright treason. The delegates from colonies already at war had to convince the rest that the only chance of victory was remaining united. The Second Continental Congress would continue to meet continuously for the rest of the war. It would eventually adopt the Articles of Confederation and continue to meet after the war, dissolving only in 1789 when it was replaced with the U.S. Congress under the new U.S. Constitution. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more details on what I discussed in this bonus episode, check out episode 64 of the American Revolution podcast. Otherwise, I will see you next week with another Revolution 250 moment.